Something shifted inside the monarchy this week, and it wasn't subtle. A frail king stood before the world and refused to step aside, but what truly stunned insiders wasn't the words. It was the timing, the coordination, and the silent message aimed directly at one man. Because this wasn't just about duty, it was about control. At first glance, the announcement looked like a simple act of determination. King Charles III, visibly weakened yet composed, appeared in a carefully staged address and made one thing unmistakably clear. He would not abdicate. No transition. No early handover. No uncertainty. But almost immediately, questions began to surface, not about what he said, but why he chose to say it now, and what might be unfolding behind the scenes. Because timing, in royal strategy, is never accidental. Reports suggest the speech came at a moment of rising tension, not just within the palace, but across the wider royal narrative. In recent days, there has been increasing chatter surrounding Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, particularly tied to appearances and activities outside the UK that some observers claim are beginning to resemble an unofficial extension of royal influence. Nothing confirmed, but enough to raise eyebrows among those who closely follow the institution. And that's where the situation becomes far more complex than it first appears. Because according to multiple reports, this wasn't just a king making a personal decision. It may have been a coordinated move involving Prince William himself. Insiders suggest that William was not only aware of the message in advance, but actively aligned with its intent. If true, that changes everything. This stops being a story about an aging monarch holding onto power, and becomes something else entirely, a strategic alignment between the present king and the future one. But here's where it gets even more interesting. There has been growing speculation, again, not confirmed, but widely discussed, that the king made a difficult personal choice in order to deliver this message. Some reports claim that certain medical treatments may have been paused or adjusted to ensure he could appear publicly with clarity and strength. Now, whether that's entirely accurate or partially exaggerated is still unclear. But the very existence of that rumor adds weight to the moment. It suggests urgency. It suggests intent. And more importantly, it suggests this wasn't optional. So the question becomes, what exactly required this level of urgency? Because if this were simply about reassuring the public, the tone would have been softer, more emotional, more reflective. Instead, what viewers noticed was something else, a kind of controlled firmness, almost as if the message wasn't directed at the public at all, but at a very specific audience watching closely from the outside. And that's where attention shifts again. Over the past week, discussions around what some commentators are calling a parallel royal narrative have intensified. The idea, still speculative, is that alternative forms of influence, branding, or representation connected to the Sussexes are beginning to operate in ways that blur the line between private life and institutional identity. Not officially, of course, but symbolically, enough to create tension. And tension, in a structure like the monarchy, is never ignored. Because the monarchy doesn't operate like a typical family, it operates like a system. A hierarchy built on clarity, continuity, and control. And when that clarity begins to blur, the response is rarely emotional. It's structural. Which brings us back to the speech. Because what King Charles III effectively did, by refusing to step down, was remove one of the most unpredictable variables in the entire system: transition. Think about it. The moment a monarch steps aside, even temporarily, the structure shifts. Power redistributes. Legal frameworks activate. And in certain scenarios, doors that were previously closed suddenly open. But by staying firmly in place, Charles appears to have done the opposite. He stabilized the structure, locked the hierarchy, removed ambiguity, and perhaps most importantly, limited access. Now, no official statement has confirmed this interpretation, but analysts have pointed toward long-standing constitutional frameworks, particularly those tied to regency and succession, which could theoretically create complex scenarios if a monarch becomes unable to perform duties or chooses to step aside. Again, this is all within the realm of speculation. But it helps explain why a firm no abdication stance might carry more weight than it appears on the surface. Because it's not just a statement, it's a boundary. And that boundary may have consequences. Because within hours of the speech, there were noticeable shifts in tone across various media discussions. Mentions of unofficial royal appearances began to be reframed. Descriptions changed. Language tightened. It's subtle, but in royal dynamics, subtle changes often signal something bigger unfolding underneath. So now the focus shifts again, not to what was said, but to what this move sets in motion. Because if this was a defensive decision, then what exactly is it defending against? And more importantly, what happens next if that pressure doesn't disappear? Because behind the calm surface of that speech, there's a growing sense that this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. What makes this situation even more intense is what was already unfolding far away from the quiet, controlled environment of that royal address. Because while King Charles III was reinforcing stability from within the system, a completely different narrative was taking shape outside of it, and the contrast between the two could not have been sharper. In recent days, attention has been drawn to a series of appearances involving Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, particularly in Australia. On the surface, these events were framed as private engagements, informal visits, or lifestyle-focused appearances. But observers quickly noticed something that didn't quite align. The structure, the staging, even the way certain moments were presented, it all carried a tone that felt familiar. Not official, but not entirely private either. And that's where the conversation started to shift. Because reports began suggesting that what was happening wasn't just casual visibility, it was something closer to a carefully constructed presence. A presence that, intentionally or not, echoed elements traditionally associated with royal engagements. Again, nothing formally confirmed, but enough consistency for analysts and commentators to start asking a difficult question. Where exactly is the line between private identity and institutional influence? And once that question enters the conversation, it becomes very hard to ignore. One moment in particular drew significant attention. During an appearance tied to a public setting that carried emotional weight, viewers noticed what appeared to be a rapid connection between that moment and external commercial activity. Links, promotions, visibility spikes, everything seemed to align almost instantly. Now, supporters argue this is simply modern branding, the natural evolution of public figures operating in a digital world. But critics see it differently. They argue that when those actions intersect with environments tied to public sentiment or legacy, the optics become complicated. And that's where tension begins to build. Because from the perspective of the monarchy, optics are not a small detail, they are everything. The institution has always relied on a very specific balance. Visibility without commercialization, influence without direct profit, presence without ownership. It's a delicate line that has been maintained for decades. And when that line appears to blur, even slightly, it doesn't go unnoticed. But here's where things take a sharper turn. According to reports, again, framed as internal discussions rather than confirmed decisions, there has been growing concern within certain official circles about how these appearances are being interpreted internationally. Not just by media, but by diplomatic observers as well. Because when individuals with royal titles appear in settings that resemble structured engagements, questions naturally arise. Are they representing themselves? Or something larger? And if that perception begins to shift, the implications extend far beyond headlines. Because the monarchy operates not just as a family, but as a constitutional symbol. Every movement, every appearance, every association carries meaning. And if alternative representations begin to emerge, whether intentional or not, it introduces a level of ambiguity that the system is not designed to accommodate. Which brings us back to the timing of that speech. Because suddenly, the urgency starts to make more sense. If there was even a possibility that parallel narratives were beginning to gain traction, then reinforcing the central authority becomes critical. Not later. Not gradually. Immediately. And that's exactly what appears to have happened. King Charles III didn't just speak, he clarified. He drew a line that re-established where authority begins and ends. But what makes this even more compelling is the role of Prince William in all of this. Because while the public sees him as the future, reports suggest he may already be operating as something more, an active strategist within the current structure. There are indications that key messaging, timing decisions, and broader narrative positioning are not being handled in isolation. Instead, they appear coordinated, aligned, purposeful, and that changes the dynamic completely. Because now, instead of a divided royal storyline, What begins to emerge is something far more unified. A present king and a future king moving in sync, reinforcing the same boundary, sending the same message, and responding to the same pressure. But here's the part that raises the stakes even higher. Because if this alignment is real, then it suggests this isn't a temporary response. It's a long-term strategy. A strategy designed not just to react to what's happening now, but to prevent what could happen next. Because once narratives begin to split, once alternative structures begin to form, even informally, they can grow quickly. And in an institution built on continuity, that kind of fragmentation is seen as a serious risk. So the question becomes unavoidable. Was the speech simply about reassurance? Or was it a direct response to something already in motion? And if it was a response, then what exactly triggered it? Because as more details begin to surface, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. This situation isn't slowing down. It's building. What started as a question of optics is now drifting into something far more serious. Structure, legality, and control. Because once the conversation moves beyond appearances and into how authority is actually defined, the stakes change completely. And this is exactly where the situation begins to tighten. Behind the scenes, there has been growing discussion, again, not officially confirmed, but widely reported, that certain institutional channels have started paying closer attention to how recent events are being framed internationally. Not just by media outlets, but by diplomatic observers and policy teams as well. Because when individuals connected to the monarchy appear to operate within spaces that resemble formal representation, even subtly, it raises a deeper concern. Who holds the authority to represent the crown? And that question is not symbolic. It's structural. Because within the United Kingdom's constitutional framework, representation is tightly defined. It's not something that can be shared, replicated, or interpreted freely. It follows a clear chain of legitimacy, one that begins with the sovereign and flows downward in a controlled, recognized manner. So when alternative forms of presence begin to echo that structure, without formal designation, it creates what some analysts are now describing as a gray zone. A space where perception and authority start to overlap. And historically, the monarchy does not tolerate gray zones for long. Because ambiguity, in this system, is a vulnerability. Which brings us to something even more critical. There have been increasing reports suggesting that internal reviews, both administrative and legal, may already be underway. These are not public investigations. Nothing officially declared. But according to sources familiar with institutional processes, certain departments have begun assessing whether recent activities could unintentionally conflict with long-standing agreements tied to royal roles and responsibilities. Now, it's important to be clear, no conclusions have been publicly confirmed. But the fact that such reviews are even being discussed indicates a shift. Because it suggests that this is no longer being treated as a media narrative, but as a structural concern. And once something enters that category, the response changes. Because the monarchy does not respond to speculation with statements, it responds to risk with systems. Which leads directly to one of the most discussed legal frameworks in this entire situation. The concept of regency. Now, for most people, this might sound distant or irrelevant. But within royal protocol, it's one of the most powerful mechanisms in place. Under certain conditions, such as incapacity or absence, the authority of the monarch can be temporarily exercised by designated individuals known as counselors of state. It's a system designed for continuity, ensuring that governance remains uninterrupted even during periods of uncertainty. But here's where things become complicated. Because within that structure, positions are not assigned based on public perception, they are determined by proximity within the line of succession. And while roles may shift over time, the framework itself remains consistent unless actively redefined. Which means, in theory, certain individuals, regardless of their current public role, may still hold a technical position within that structure. Now, whether that position carries practical influence in today's context is a separate question. But the existence of that possibility is enough to trigger concern within institutional planning. And suddenly, the importance of that no abdication stance becomes much clearer. Because as long as King Charles III remains fully in place, the conditions required to activate that framework simply do not exist. No transition. No temporary redistribution of authority. No gray areas. Everything remains fixed. And that, in itself, is a powerful form of control. But it doesn't stop there. Because alongside these structural considerations, there has also been renewed attention on previously established agreements, particularly those tied to the use of royal titles and their connection to commercial activity. These agreements, while not always publicly detailed, are understood to include clear expectations about how and where titles can be associated with external ventures. And this is where tensions begin to surface again. Because if any activity, intentionally or indirectly, appears to blur that boundary, it raises questions. Not necessarily accusations, but questions. About alignment. About interpretation. About whether the original terms are being upheld in both letter and spirit. And in a system built on precedent, those questions matter. Because once a precedent is challenged, even subtly, it forces the institution to respond. Not emotionally, not publicly, but structurally. Which brings us back to the bigger picture. Because when you connect all these elements, the reinforced authority, the timing of the speech, the reported internal reviews, the legal frameworks quietly sitting in the background, a pattern begins to emerge. This isn't reactive. It's preventative. A move designed not just to address what's visible today, but to close off pathways that could become problematic tomorrow. And if that's the case, then what we're witnessing is not a single decision, but a coordinated strategy. A strategy that suggests the monarchy is no longer simply managing narratives, it's actively reshaping the boundaries of influence itself. But here's where the tension deepens even further. Because if the system is tightening from within, what happens to those operating outside it? Because the more defined the structure becomes, the less space there is for anything that doesn't fully align. And that raises a question that hasn't been answered yet. Not publicly, not clearly, but it's there. If the monarchy is reinforcing its boundaries this aggressively, then what exactly triggered it to act now? And more importantly, what happens next if those boundaries are pushed again? What makes the situation even more volatile is that the pressure is no longer coming from just one direction. It's building from multiple fronts at the same time: legal, financial, and reputational, and each one is beginning to intersect in ways that are difficult to ignore. Because while the public conversation is still focused on speeches and appearances, reports suggest something far more intense may be unfolding quietly behind closed doors. There has been increasing talk of financial scrutiny surrounding recent activities linked to the broader Sussex circle. Nothing formally confirmed, but enough signals for analysts to start connecting patterns, especially when it comes to how events are funded, structured, and presented. And once money enters the conversation, everything changes. Because financial transparency is one of the few areas where institutions move from observation to action very quickly. It's no longer about perception, it becomes about accountability. And according to multiple discussions circulating among insiders, certain transactions and arrangements tied to recent appearances may be drawing attention. Not accusations, not conclusions, but attention. And attention, in this context, is the first stage of something bigger. Because if even a small part of those activities overlaps with structures connected to official resources, security, access, influence, it raises a critical question. Where does private activity end and institutional benefit begin? That line matters. Because crossing it, even unintentionally, could trigger reviews that go far beyond media narratives. Reviews that involve departments, oversight bodies, and frameworks that operate quietly but decisively. And that's exactly why this phase feels different. It's no longer just about image, it's about exposure. But here's where things take an even sharper turn. There have also been whispers, again, unverified but widely discussed, that certain organizers and partners linked to these events may be facing internal pressure of their own. Questions about payments, agreements, and expected outcomes. Some reports even suggest that not everything has gone according to plan behind the scenes. Delays, disruptions, unmet expectations. Now, whether those claims hold weight is still unclear. But the pattern they suggest is important, because it points to something deeper, a system that may be under strain. And when systems under strain begin to crack, the effects are rarely contained. Which brings us to the internal dynamic itself. Because alongside the external pressure, there are increasing reports describing tension within the core circle. Subtle at first, then more visible. Observers have noted moments where interactions appear strained, where alignment doesn't feel as smooth as it once did. Body language, timing, positioning, small details, but in high-profile environments, small details are rarely accidental. Some accounts describe a growing imbalance, where strategic decisions seem to be driven more heavily from one side, while others appear increasingly detached. Again, nothing confirmed, but enough to raise questions about how unified the direction really is. And that matters more than it seems. Because when external pressure rises, internal unity becomes critical. Without it, decision-making slows, responses become inconsistent, and narratives begin to fragment. And fragmentation, in a high-stakes environment like this, is dangerous. Because it creates openings. Openings that institutions are trained to recognize and respond to. Which brings everything back to the position of Prince William and King Charles III. Because while these external and internal pressures build, their response has remained remarkably consistent, controlled, measured, and increasingly firm. There's no escalation in tone, no reactive statements, just a steady tightening of structure. And that kind of response is rarely accidental. It suggests preparation. Preparation for scenarios that may not have fully surfaced yet, but are being anticipated. Because in institutional strategy, the most effective moves are not the ones that react to visible problems, but the ones that neutralize risks before they fully emerge. And this begins to explain why the earlier decision, the refusal to abdicate, carries so much weight. It wasn't just about maintaining position. It was about maintaining control at a moment when multiple variables were starting to shift at once. Financial scrutiny, narrative tension, internal strain, all converging. And when convergence happens, timing becomes everything. Because acting too late allows issues to escalate. But acting early, before everything becomes visible, creates a different kind of advantage. It allows the institution to define the boundaries before they are tested. And that appears to be exactly what's happening. But here's where the tension reaches another level. Because if these pressures continue to build, if financial questions deepen, if internal alignment weakens, if external perception continues to blur the lines, then the situation may reach a point where quiet observation is no longer enough. Where structural responses become visible. And that's when things truly change. Because once institutional mechanisms move from behind the scenes into the public domain, the narrative shifts completely. It's no longer about speculation or interpretation. It becomes about outcome. And outcomes, in this context, are rarely reversible. So the real question now isn't whether pressure exists. It clearly does. The question is how far it will go before something forces the next move. Because everything so far, every signal, every shift, every carefully timed decision, points to one thing. This isn't slowing down. It's building towards something much bigger. And just when it seems like every angle has already been explored, another layer begins to emerge. One that shifts the entire conversation from tension to consequence. Because up until now, everything has existed in a kind of controlled pressure zone. Questions without answers. Signals without confirmation. Movement without visible outcome. But that phase doesn't last forever. At some point, pressure either stabilizes or it forces a result. And according to growing discussions behind the scenes, that moment may be closer than many expected. Because there are now increasing indications, still unconfirmed, but gaining attention, that long-term structural changes could be under consideration. Not reactive decisions, not emotional responses, but calculated adjustments designed to prevent situations like this from happening again. Adjustments that could redefine how royal identity, titles, and public roles are interpreted in the modern era. And if that's true, then what we're watching isn't just a response to current events. It's the early stage of a reset. Now, what that reset might look like is still unclear. But analysts have pointed towards several possibilities. Some suggest tighter definitions around what constitutes official representation. Others mention clearer separation between institutional roles and private ventures. And then there are those who believe the most significant changes may come in the form of updated guidelines tied to succession and participation. Rules that determine not just who is in the line, but how that position is maintained. Again, nothing confirmed. But the direction of the conversation is shifting. From reaction to redesign. And that shift matters. Because once an institution like the monarchy begins to redefine its internal rules, the effects are rarely isolated. They ripple outward, affecting perception, influence, and long-term positioning. What begins as a structural adjustment can quickly reshape the entire narrative. Which brings everything back to the central dynamic. Because at the core of all of this are two very different approaches to influence. On one side, you have a system built on continuity, discipline, and clearly defined boundaries, represented by King Charles III and Prince William. A model that prioritizes structure over flexibility, control over expansion, and legacy over immediacy. On the other side, you have a more modern, fluid approach, one that operates through visibility, adaptability, and direct engagement with public platforms. A model that doesn't rely on traditional frameworks, but instead builds its own. Individually, both approaches can exist. But when they begin to overlap, that's when conflict becomes inevitable, because they operate on fundamentally different rules. And what we're seeing now is what happens when those rules collide. But here's the part that raises the stakes even further. Because if structural changes are indeed being considered, if boundaries are being redefined, if roles are being clarified, then the outcome won't just affect the present moment. It will shape the future. Not just for the individuals involved, but for the institution itself. Because every major shift in royal history has followed a similar pattern. A period of tension, a moment of decision, and then a transformation that redefines how the monarchy functions moving forward. And this moment feels uncomfortably similar. Which leads to the final question. If this is a turning point, which direction does it take? Does the institution tighten its structure even further, closing off any ambiguity and reinforcing a single, unified narrative? Or does it adapt, creating space for modern interpretations while still maintaining its core identity? Because whichever path is chosen, there's no going back. And that's what makes this moment so significant. Not the headlines. Not the speculation, but the underlying shift that's happening quietly, steadily, and with increasing clarity. Something is changing. The boundaries are being redrawn. And once that process is complete, the monarchy that emerges may look very different from the one we've known. So now it comes down to you. What do you think this really is? A necessary move to protect the institution, or the beginning of a deeper divide that could reshape everything? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you want more deep, high-level breakdowns like this, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next development in this story might change everything all over again.